So this quote from the Sydney Morning Herald gives us a good broad overview of her style. It's sort of everyday people going about their everyday lives. We view it as an observer rather than someone actively engaged in the process, usually, as you would a doctor. And it also comments on her scientific training, which is something that's quite obvious throughout the story in the kind of vocabulary that's used around medical terms, bones, body parts, all those sort of anatomical features, as well as the kind of propensity of diseases within all of the story. So there's a whole list of things here, representative of a broad range of our Australian community, and she's even commented herself on, how difficult and how challenging that is for her as one single voice to attempt in this anthology to sort of bring out the voices of different people. And obviously she's drawing on the people that she knows, the people she has dinner with, and her patients especially as a general practitioner, to kind of pull these stories together and make something that's a little bit believable, let's say, for each of these various subsets of our community that she's exploring. So this is where it gets really difficult. There's characters as sort of symbolic, so sometimes the Australian characters are just Australian, and sometimes the Chinese student character is just a Chinese student, but obviously you'll be challenged throughout this process to sort of think of the way that the characters you create and the characters that she has created, constructed, built are representative of broader issues and what she's trying to communicate about Australia, about racism, about identity, about belonging, and so forth. And you're also going to have to be doing that yourself. So I've got here focus on description, but that actually depends on what story you choose to base your actual writing on. Some of them are usually the shorter stories are very description heavy, whereas some of the longer ones that are more heavily plotted don't really commit such large chunks to description. So there's actually quite a distinctive style between the two different lengths of story. And you could even suggest that maybe the limitation of a word count of the short story is what partly is bringing out her need to be descriptive, because she can't basically fall upon plot as something to explain things for her. So the stories focus on normal people, the mundane, the everyman, the every woman, everyday people going about their lives, flawed characters as we all are, just doing the best in the life that they have based upon their particular personalities and skill sets within the world. So the stories focus very heavily on internal dialogue, and quite often this is sort of italicized internal monologue. So it might be, the story is being told usually from a third person perspective, and then it's intercut with either sides or quite extensive passages of italicized internal dialogue of, what they're thinking while these events are occurring. So I've got here deft dialogue. There's quite limited dialogue, really. It's not that significant a part of the short stories. And it's almost always done without, over explanation of who said what and so forth. Quite often each character is identified, and then we have quite a long string of back and forth, and typically quite short and deft and precise dialogue. I've got here limited plot, but again that's debatable really depending on which story we're talking about. Some of them are very plot rich, and some of them by nature of their breadth are required to be quite light on plot and therefore quite heavy on description and evocative language and strong images and motifs throughout. Also, emotionless and detached are two words that came from a number of reviews that I read of her work, and I think that that's usually a pretty safe assumption, but again, depending on the story that you choose, that may not be true for the writing that you create yourself. And then vignettes is basically just a short personal story or a personal account of one particular person. So you'll be most likely creating your own vignette about a particular character or a particular event within your life, or one that you've heard from a family member or someone has explained to you. So that's really broad scope authorial style. That's kind of words that have been used typically in reviews to describe her writing. We'll aim to replicate this style and this focus, but there's also obviously functional elements that we'll need to copy around the way that she writes and the way that she constructs sentences, paragraphs, and then of course the entire story itself.